For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Motsabi Hoyane. Political analyst Aubrey Machikri joins me to discuss President Jacob Zuma's leadership prospects ahead of South Africa's 2014 elections. How can one reflect on the widespread discontent regarding Jacob Zuma's leadership in South Africa, and how can we objectively analyze the current political state of affairs?
Well, the question is how widespread is that discontent about the president? And what that means for me is whether it extends sufficiently, firstly, to the ANC's electoral support base, and whether it extends sufficiently to the rank and file of the ANC. Because unless it extends sufficiently to those places, the ANC will not be affected adversely by the discontent. In other words, are the people who are unhappy the people who matter in relation to the outcome of the election?
Do you think that the current ANC dispensation could live up to the precepts and principles established by Madiba's legacy, and should it aspire to those standards, bearing in mind the current political dynamics in the country?
Well, the thing to remember is that the values that have become associated with Nelson Mandela are values that he himself found in the ANC. And therefore the challenge, as was articulated by President Jacob Zuma when the ANC launched its election manifesto, is for the ANC to reconnect with those values. Of course, the extent to which that will be possible, given the fact that in the alliance and in the ANC itself, there are still battles for power and resources, depends on whether President Jacob Zuma and the collective leadership of the ANC can provide leadership both to the ANC and to the alliance in such a way that the ANC becomes a much more effective instrument in dealing with these battles for power and resources.
You mentioned in your column the feeling of insignificance on the part of South African citizens engendered by the response of the government. Can you elaborate on this?
Well, if you look at e-tolling, I do believe that people became quite angry the moment they were told that e-tolling was not a dream and would happen. And what that struck in their minds was a note of arrogance on the part of the government. And therefore, in a sense, in their response, they were trying to show the government that they would not be talked down to in that manner. There have been other examples, including some of the responses to controversies around Nkandla Gate, for instance, that have suggested that some in the ANC are communicating with citizens in a manner that lends itself to the interpretation that the ANC is guilty of the arrogance of power. And therefore, in part, this election is about whether the citizen feels insignificant enough because of these to register his or her protest to the advantage of the ANC's opponents, that is, opposition parties. I suspect that whatever ill feeling the citizen feels towards the ANC is not going to be reflected sufficiently in the election result.
Bearing in mind both the ANC's internal and public resolution, do you think the party is ready for the electoral challenges it might face this year?
Well, if readiness is about resources, you can be certain that the ANC is going to deploy a large component of the resources that will be available to all political parties. In other words, most of the resources that will be deployed in this election campaign will be deployed by the ANC. And secondly, if you look at what is contained in the election manifesto, the election manifesto is a case of more continuity than change. And therefore, the ANC probably faces the accusation that this election manifesto is merely more of the same, while it might argue that actually the reason why there's much more emphasis on continuity is because there is unfinished business. The question is whether the ANC and the ANC government are in a state to deal effectively with the unfinished business. And I suppose the question therefore you're asking is not only about the ANC, It's also about whether the ANC government is ready to deliver on the promise of shifting focus to economic emancipation.
You speak about the whispering campaign behind President Jacob Zuma's back. What is it about and what are its implications?
Well, there are concerns, and these concerns obtain inside and outside the ANC about the negative image of the president and how his image has suffered because of issues such as Nkandla. Now, as I said, some of those who are concerned are in the ANC itself, as a result of which there has been a whispering campaign about the dangers of having Jacob Zuma as the face of the ANC campaign. Now, that issue has been dealt with. It was very clear when the ANC launched its manifesto that not having Jacob Zuma as the face of the ANC campaign is not an option. And in part, that comes from resolutions that were taken by the ANC in Polokwane with regard to the centers of power, where it was decided that the ANC president would be not only the presidential candidate, but if the ANC wins an election, would be the head of state. So that part of the argument is closed. What is left is whether those inside the party who are concerned about the president are so concerned as to wait for the election result. And if the election result is not good for the ANC, despite the fact that the ANC will retain power, whether they will blame this on the president, and if they do, what action after the election they will believe the ANC should take to deal with that challenge.
And lastly, do you think there's a possibility this time around that President Jacob Zuma could get ousted if attention is paid to democratic processes?
Well, if you go into the whispering campaign suggests that there are some in the ANC, first of all, who don't want Jacob Zuma to even begin the second term. And if, of course, as will be the case, he becomes head of state, may not want him to finish the second term. Now, of course, if President Jacob Zuma does not finish and is recalled by the ANC, the concern will be that this is the second head of state in succession who is recalled. And the concern is that that would undermine confidence. So I suspect, even if there are those who don't want him, first to begin a second term, and secondly, if he does, or when he does, to finish the second term. Despite whether this is a large or a small number, I suspect those who will win the argument are those who are concerned about how such a recall would undermine confidence, especially in the global markets and among international investors. On the other hand, if more scandals emerge, you can't rule out the possibility that some of them may be so big that the ANC has no choice but to recall him.
That was Aubrey Machiki discussing South Africa's upcoming elections as well as the leadership dynamics in the ruling party.